Welcome to the final session of our conference on the uses of Oracy we've organised this week. The title of this roundtable, the fifth of our roundtable discussions, is How Are Pupils' Spoken Selves Embraced Within UK Education? And to some degree, there's an element of leading question in the title here, and it may in fact be the case that it's not all pupils' spoken selves are adequately embraced within the UK education systems currently, and that's something that we can problematize and discuss as we go on today. But I'll introduce our panel of speakers. So in no particular order, we have firstly Matteo Bergamini, who is director of the social enterprise Shout Out UK, which aims to give young people a voice and to help to engage further engagement in issues of citizenship in the UK. We have Maeve McKinnon, who's an education officer with Education Scotland, the executive body of the Scottish Government with a role in improving standards in Scottish education. And Maeve is a specialist in Gaelic medium education, the system of immersion education we have here for inculcating a sense of bilingual oracy in children. So we'll hear more from Maeve as we go on. Then it's a great pleasure to introduce Sonia Thompson, who's head teacher of St Matthew's Primary School in Birmingham. Hello, Sonia. Then we have Rupert Hyam, who is associate lecturer in educational leadership at the Institute of Education in UCL. And last but very much not least, Lee Jerome, who is associate professor of education at Middlesex University. So welcome all of you. It's fantastic to have you all here this afternoon, this evening, I should say, actually, because the light is fading fast here in Scotland. It will be nighttime quite soon. So it's a pleasure to see you all. So I'll put the first question for this afternoon's roundtable in the chat here, just so we can keep tabs on it. So my question for each of you, and we'll go round, is what spaces exist for pupils to explore their various identities and engage in thoughtful speech within the different UK educational settings in which you will work and which we're based. So Sonia, I might come to you firstly, if I may, and ask what you think about the spaces for this exploration of identities and development of speaking skills in UK schools.
I certainly, for me, it's an area that's developing. It's an area that has been part of the curriculum for a long time, particularly in terms of speaking and listening, in terms of oracy. I think teachers have felt a little bit adrift with it because pre-2014, there was a bit more meat on the bones in terms of what does good, thoughtful talk, oracy look like. Now it's been reduced to kind of 8 statements that work their way across the primary curriculum, at least, and I can only really speak for primary. But I would say that there is there's a definite need and a want for teachers. I think we are aware that we need to make sure that there are spaces, there are opportunities for our children to engage with talk. I think we know that it's kind of the cornerstone of the teaching that we do in terms of teaching reading, writing. We know that it's the thing that is the cornerstone of that. Whether or not we're fantastic at it is another story. I think there's a lot more training and support that teachers need in order to make it really, really purposeful. But I think there is a sea change. I think things are changing. Oracy and the terminology, the word oracy, is becoming a really powerful word at least in the primary curriculum. Certainly in my school, we've had regular training. I've got someone who I consider on my staff a specialist in oracy, who's been really supporting our staff, and we've been looking at the work of Lauren Resnick, and looking at accountable talk, and looking at accountable talk in the community and standards and knowledge. So we're starting to have those discussions around the importance of talk. But as I said, whether or not we would see ourselves as experts, and therefore able to really facilitate opportunities for children to really use talk in terms of developing their identities, and doing that on a regular, sustained, progressive basis across primary. I'm not sure how confident we are. So I think there's probably patches of really good practice. And obviously schools like Voice 21, obviously Cambridge, there's lots of work that's come out of what they've done. And again, schools are bringing that on board, and working with organisations like Voice 21 to scale up practitioners. So I think it's an interesting picture, but certainly one for primary that needs further development. And it's something that as a research school, we're currently looking at. We are currently working with Oracy Cambridge to look at something that we can do to support particularly schools in Birmingham, because we know that that's one of our priority areas. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Ronnie. That's really helpful. Matteo, could I bring you in from your perspective, working with young people? Do you feel this is just like Sonia was saying, it's something that's changing, it's something that's developing rapidly currently? How have you seen things change in recent years?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I've seen things change quite drastically. Some in a good way and some in a not so great way. Just to give you a bit of context, so us as an organisation, we deliver political and media literacy programs in secondary schools and colleges. So really quickly, political literacy is the kind of bare bone basic understanding as to how a democracy functions. So understanding, how to vote, how to register, what's parliament, how does a bill become a law, all those kind of basic things that realistically all schools should do as a part of citizenship or elsewhere. But obviously, because of a variety of issues, a lot of schools don't do it or don't have the capacity to do it. And then media literacy is how to critically analyze information that we receive either online, offline, TV, radio, etc. And within all of this, obviously, oracy as well as emotional resilience that we, in our context, we believe actually is a big part of oracy, because to be able to have those in-depth conversations, you need to also be able to listen to the other side. And if you're not emotionally resilient enough to hear someone else's opinion that potentially drastically differs from yours, there is that level of breakdown of communication, and it can get quite frictionful, if that's the word. It can get some friction if there isn't that kind of level of emotional resilience. And one thing that we've seen in terms of our work with citizenship organizations or citizenship studies rather in schools and schools that don't have it but do want to teach political and media literacy. So sometimes they do it, say, as part of English lessons or history or government politics or whatever else, is that young people are now probably more politically active and engaged than they've arguably ever been, which is a good thing, because it shows that young people want to not just understand the system, understand a democracy, but also want to talk. And to talk, you need to have that ability to vocalize what you think, but also listen to the other side and have those kind of constructive debates, which is a lot of what oracy, I would argue, is about. So there is that want from young people. The problem is obviously that, and I don't think any of us are shy to say this, that the current environment at the moment has gotten a bit toxic in terms of political debates, both online, in kind of main spheres of politics. We can see it because, in certain aspects, it has become quite toxic where, one side doesn't listen to the other and vice versa, which can push people away from those kind of conversations. And it can make schools and teachers a little bit, for lack of a better word, shyer to delivering this kind of works. And we did a bit of research with the University of Sheffield last year, which was a massive comprehensive study of, I think it's about just over 3,000 teachers across England around, do they feel like they have a duty to teach political literacy? Overwhelmingly, they said yes. What was shocking to us was that less than 1% said that they felt they had the tools to actually deliver this effectively. So there is a massive issue here between teachers wanting to deliver this, young people wanting to learn this stuff, but there isn't the skill set at the moment within the teaching profession from teachers themselves to deliver this effectively. And there is that kind of problem. And some schools do it amazingly well, and we've seen some incredible examples. And then on the flip side, there are just some schools that just, because of funding, because of a variety of issues, or because of just lack of staff to deliver this kind of stuff, they aren't able to do it. So there is a positive in the sense that there's a want from young people and teachers to do this kind of stuff, but there is also this kind of lack of skill to do it properly and effectively, as well as the kind of toxicity of the environment that we live in at the moment. And just as a kind of final point, in terms of Oracy for us, I think the main aspect of, for us, where we see it being delivered, or where often we see it being delivered very well, is in citizenship lessons, where you have that link between political literacy and understanding how our democracy functions, and the ability to have those in-depth conversations with that emotional resilience at the other side, which, if we look at society in general at the moment, is something that is massively lacking. Just add on top of that as well, in terms of, say, something like PSHE, which includes media literacy within it, is something that also, I think, really needs to embed Oracy, just because, again, one of the big societal issues we're seeing now, especially with young people that we deal with, is in regards to things like social media, which creates these kind of bubbles, camps, where you don't need to be good at Oracy because you are speaking to the same people that believe the same things that you do. So you don't build up emotional resilience because you're getting fed the same kind of information that you believe, reinforcing your beliefs, and you're able to push away anyone that disagrees with you. That's not good, constructive processes when it comes to, say, democracy, which requires good Oracy because it requires good debate to then, together to come up with a good solution. So I see it embedded and I see it happening in kind of those two places, but purely linking that with media and political literacy. I hope that's made sense, and I hope this answers your question.
Thanks a lot, Matteo. No, absolutely. Yeah, that's really, really useful. Maeve, I wonder if I can bring you in here on the point of places for development of identity in schools, and in the context of Gaelic medium education, specifically in Scotland, and opportunities for engagement and thoughtful speech. It might be helpful if you could explain a little bit about the context of Gaelic medium education as well.
Yeah, sure, Stuart. Thank you. So yes, here in Scotland, if I talk first of all just briefly about Gaelic education, which has 3 interrelated components, and those are Gaelic medium education, Gaelic learner education, and the promotion of learning about Gaelic language and culture. Now, Gaelic medium education, which I will mainly refer to as part of our discussions, is a relatively new system, follows Curriculum for Excellence, and one that is based on the principles of immersion. And at the early stages, that's total immersion. Immersion in the Gaelic language where no other language is used within the class. And just also maybe to mention as well that our work, for Gaelic medium education articulates to our national plan for Gaelic. And that plan has 3 objectives, which are increasing the use of Gaelic, increasing the learning of Gaelic, and promoting a positive image for Gaelic. So I hope that kind of gives a kind of a setting the scene, context for you all. If I think and talk first about the early stage of learning through the medium of Gaelic, where I mentioned there that no other language, is used, we do refer to that as total immersion, where listening and talking skills are a priority for development. And this is followed by an immersion phase where the curriculum continues to be taught through the medium of Gaelic, and children develop their reading and their writing skills in the English language. And that usually happens around after the sort of 3rd year, 4th year of primary school. But the immersion phase, the total immersion phase, does include nursery stages as well. So in terms of thinking about appropriate spaces for pupils to explore their identities and to engage in thoughtful speech about, through Gaelic, and in remembering that Gaelic may not be their first language, it may not be the language of the home. So it's extremely important that these spaces are created and for language to be, developed. And that the school environment will be that space for many children. So it needs to be that the identity, of the school then becomes so important. Because if the school doesn't have a strong identity and doesn't identify that Gaelic is part of their identity and what they are promoting and valuing, then it's difficult to try and think how then are pupils going to be able to explore their identities if they don't really feel a connection there with the school, the work of the school, and the staff. And it's not just about teaching staff. Our teaching staff, are skilled, they work hard to develop language, to extend language, to take language beyond the classroom. But there is also a crucial role for non-teaching staff within schools that deliver, Gaelic medium education. And that really needs to be acknowledged and needs to be valued and supports that rich development of language. And also in considering that experiences and these spaces need to be planned for, needs to be thought through, and it needs to be thought through carefully. And the range of contexts and situations that young people will have to acquire and further develop their fluency, because that's where we want to get them to, is so important. And it really does start, at the planning stage. So adults, who engage with children have such an important role to play. And we're looking at things like the use of high quality language, because that's what the children and the young people are taking away, with them. That Gaelic is spoken all the time. All the time, there's an environment created where Gaelic is valued. Staff are working alongside, interacting with children in a variety of spaces and environments to enable that language development. But at the same time, allowing children to follow their interests, be creative and be curious. And an example that I would like to just bring to your attention is one of where, in thinking about the secondary context, where we go through immersion, total immersion education, and then onto an immersion phase through primary, but it changes going into secondary because of moving to a subject-based format, and so children and young people are not exposed to Gaelic in the same way. But a space that a school in Argyll and Bute actually created was that they used a vertical house class time system where they take pupils from S1 up to S6 a couple of times a week, allow them to come together, have an immersion experience together where they explore their ideas, what their interests are, and have discuss topics. And there is that opportunity to develop language in a social context. So that is so important as well for them. So it's that kind of whole school approach, everybody involved and everybody valuing how important it is for this language development. Hope that makes sense.
Great, thanks very much, Maeve. Yes, so a context of UK education that I think will be less familiar to a lot of people in our audience, but I think one which is really grappling with these same questions of oracy, the development of speaking skills, and also identities and spaces for thoughtful engagement with ideas around language and speech. Rupert, I'd like to bring you in on the idea of spaces for thoughtful speech and the development of the spoken self. Oh, you're muted, Rupert. Hold on.
Oh goodness, sorry about that.
No, you're okay.
There we go. So I'd like to come at it at a slightly different angle, from as a sort of logician, if you like, and think about the criteria and the background for thoughtful speech to take place. And I think, since the question asks about pupils, we have to start thinking about the classroom, since I would argue that any provision that seeks to achieve these spaces outside the classroom might well be valuable, but could only probably ever be partial, rather than covering all. We can't expect voluntary and extracurricular activity to cover it for the majority. So for the conditions for thoughtful speech exploring identity to exist in the classroom, then I think a few things need to be in place. Firstly, children have to have the skills and the dispositions to listen to others, to speak with others, with curiosity, with reciprocity, and with compassion. And I think the first question for me then is, where would they learn to do this? Do they learn to do that at home? Or from the TV or from YouTube? Do they learn it from teachers? Do they learn it from friends? Children need genuine examples of compassionate, humane dialogue to engage with. Otherwise, how are they going to learn it? Because I would argue that in those contexts that I just set out, most of them are not contexts where you have the sorts of broadly equal relationship in which that sort of dialogue flourishes. And I guess then the next question, and one thing I think we can really do about that in schools is actually give children examples. Why not have an assembly where the teachers engage in a genuine dialogue around a topic in front of the kids, without scripting it in advance, and show them what it's like, or show them videos of genuine dialogues held by young people. Otherwise, how will they know? Another point then is, how is children's capacity to engage in that sort of dialogue observed and developed in lessons? And that's a sort of pedagogical and sort of systemic issue, because without giving time and thought to that, it's almost certain to fall by the wayside in relation to other more regulated activities. And I guess so the next question then for me is, children also have to have regular opportunities to speak at some length in lessons around issues that impact on their identities. Where's this going to happen? Will it happen within curriculum time in particular subjects that seem most amenable to it, like PSHE and English and RE, for example? Or do schools also find relevance to pupils' lived experience and interests within other subjects such as science, maths, and history? I would argue that in order to really genuinely develop that oracy, you need to find multiple opportunities across the range of subject disciplines in order to do that. And the last thing I think that needs to be in place is that teachers and schools have to be actively promoting a culture of openness and trust, and pedagogies that can translate that into genuine dialogue. And so just briefly on the English context, then I'd argue that since around that there was some of that going on, right? And we had the Crick report in 2000, and we had citizenship education, and we had the 4-part language exam, including English. But since around 2014, the English curriculum and the assessment system has greatly reduced its focus on oracy, which the ex-schools minister in England, Nick Gibb, referred to as idle chatter in relation to dialogic approaches, and in favour of an increasing focus on knowledge mastery. And even in subjects like English, for example, that's taken the form of a focus on like technical linguistic vocabulary, for example, and knowledge of periods of literature, more than the techniques of speech and listening. So while Nick Gibb may have moved on, I don't think that overall policy direction has. And we've heard from Sonia that there are some fantastic examples of schools bucking that trend. But until we have sort of widespread and systemic ways of recognizing and acknowledging the value of thoughtful exploratory dialogue, alongside the dominant focus on written assessments, the scope for classrooms as spaces of dialogue is limited at the moment.
Thanks very much, Rupert. Lee, is that how you feel about the situation currently? What would you say in response to this idea of sufficient space to develop identities, to engage in thoughtful speech?
Well, I'm going to agree with people, really. I think for me, what Rupert and Sonia have been describing really is the fact that we did have and have lost some kind of top-down policy momentum around Oracy, in particular areas of the curriculum and across the curriculums, the kind of lifeblood of learning. So I think the top-down policy pressure has gone, but we might hope it comes back again. In England, I think the situation is probably slightly less negative in Scotland and Wales. But what we have then, Sonia referred to as patches, is really this kind of bottom-up network of schools and organisations working with schools that are trying to sustain what we achieved before it was kind of, at least went into a period of neglect from a government perspective. So we have to think that some of those teachers and those networks can still keep pushing at the edges and develop practice. But I think the major problem for us in terms of equipping people for democratic citizenship and life in our democratic, diverse society is until we reconnect with some top-down policy, it's not going to be experienced as an entitlement for all children. And that's basically the problem that we're all coming at from our own different directions, isn't it? So I suspect we're all busy breathing life into that bottom-up development in our schools and institutions and networks, but hoping that there will come an opportunity. And I suppose the positive side is that in those networks is some incredibly fresh developmental work, so that when policymakers finally catch up with us, we won't be reintroducing what we had in 2010. We'll be introducing some new, sparkling, exciting, student-centered pedagogic strategies that will be much more engaging and efficient. So we can't be completely doomy gloomy, because there are hundreds of thousands of teachers doing brilliant stuff, but it's just sad for those kids who aren't working with those teachers, because I don't know quite what they're getting in any organised fashion. One thing I will say is my kind of part of that grassroots development is working with the Association for Citizenship Teaching, which is still fighting the fight. We still have citizenship as a national curriculum subject, not that you would know it from spending time in schools looking at their actual talk curriculum, but that commits schools to developing skills of debate and argument in relation to knowledge around learning about diverse national, religious and ethnic identities in the UK. So it's there. We just need to make sure that it happens more often. I've just dropped into the chat one of our latest attempts to do that with a group of teachers, and this was unusual because it did attract some DFE funding to help us get it off the ground. But it's based around that notion of, as Rupert said, picking up on the centrality of classrooms really for students. I mean, that is largely where they spend most of their time in schools and where they encounter most kind of progressively planned curricula. So we've taken this idea of the classroom as a deliberative space, and then work with teachers on developing resources, but also training and professional support, so that they can start to think of their classroom as a space that increasingly builds good habits for public deliberation. So we might talk a bit about that in a bit more detail later on, but that's kind of my contribution really. We need to kind of keep our eye on the curriculum.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot, Lee. That's wonderful hearing from all of you. I'm going to put this our second question to deliberate on. So my question for you really is, how do the types of speech and discourse that students use, that they produce, actually reflect their identities or their spoken selves, as we say, in our multicultural society? Sonia, sorry to come back to you first again, but I just wonder what is it that children at St Matthew's are saying? What kinds of speech do they produce around their identities, their understanding of their place in society?
I'd like to think that we offer quite a lot of opportunities. I think we are one of those schools that are trying to really grow from the ground up, some really strong opportunities for our children. And our curriculum, I think we've worked very hard to ensure that Oracy permeates all curriculum areas. And that is our goal, for Oracy to be part of everything we do. I think one of our strengths is that we have got a curriculum that really does focus on our children's heritage and their culture. So as part of in any curriculum area that we do something called Sharing Literacy Lives. It very, very much comes from the work of Louis Moll, which looks at the fact that our identity and heritage is really important as a real opportunity for that reciprocity within the school walls. And actually, if we inhabit and enable children to talk about themselves, about their home lives, about their families, about their culture, then that is a starting place, because they've got the knowledge there. They've got the knowledge of their own selves. So it's about giving them a space to talk about their own selves. And that is the starting point for building good Oracy practice, of course, because it is about listening to each other. It's about discussing each other and comparing lives. And we as adults also share our lives. So we share our lives with the children. We talk about our own heritage and our own culture. I think the other thing that we are really, really trying to work on, and again, it comes off the back of us being a school that we love reading, we love books, and books are a great way in to discussing. It's that opportunity, isn't it, that for children to look into other people's lives, and that mirror window and sliding door opportunity, and there are some fantastic books, and more the kind of diverse books the books that represent our children in terms of colour, in terms of poverty, in terms of social class. Those are the books that when you read them and you study them with the children, they're a good way of sparking discussions and debates around people's lives and about them and relating it back to their own lives. So organisations like Empathy Lab are fantastic for that, where children are really encouraged to use books to uncover and look at their own emotions, to look at how people's lives are inhabited, what the impact of poverty is, what the impact of race is, gender. And there's lots of brilliant picture books, children's picture books. There's lots of brilliant chapter books across primary and secondary now that really do that well. And as I said, a day like Empathy Day is a great opportunity to do that. And we know that children, the research says that children can be taught how to be empathetic. And I think the idea that through the use of picture books and the use of discussion that those types of books enable our children to have, it is a really powerful changer. And we've been doing things like that for about 2 years now, 3 years now, really focusing in on the use of picture books to enable those discussions to happen. We also do things like Debate Mate, and the children are very vocal. I think somebody said children are very political, they're very vocal. I was walking in the dining hall the other day, our year threes, that's the 7-year-olds, they said to me, Miss Thompson, what do you think of Boris Johnson? What do you think of what he's done? They're 7. They know these things. They know what's right and they know what's wrong. They're very, very, they're very savvy. And I think they want to talk. I think, is it Matteo? You talked about the fact that children want to talk. They want us to open these spaces for them to have the discussions. So it is about schools enabling that to happen. And I just think the whole evidence base around Oracy, we would be silly not to open those spaces, because it is through the ability to confidently talk about issues that we hope to grow a generation that's going to be a bit more aware, a bit more empathetic, and a bit more they want to take action against things that are happening. We don't just want them to be passive, we want them to be active, being an active citizen who can speak with eloquence about what you want people to understand is really important. And I think primary's got a big job to do that. And again, I know that Maeve was talking about starting really early in terms of Gaelic. I think it's important that we start early and enable our children to be confident.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Sonia. Who would like to come in here? Matteo, I saw thumbs up and big agreement with Sonia there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to come in and just applaud Sonia a little bit more, just because I mean, 100% agree with what she's saying, and like she mentioned, you know, young people are, and again, that's the big positive, isn't it? That young people at this moment in time want to have these conversations, want to learn the skills of oracy. There is no uphill struggle about, you know, that we think young people need this but don't want it. Do you know what I mean? Like they desperately want these skills, and it's down to schools and kind of us as society to facilitate what young people want. And you know, just to give a kind of a really silly example, in terms of when we run our political and our media literacy programs, one kind of very basic activity that we do, for instance, is we get everyone in the class to stand up, and we make one wall very pro, one wall very against, and we ask a question, and then they have to go to one side of the wall or the other, depending on how extreme their view is on that thing. They have to get closer to the wall or not, and then they will have a kind of discussion about it. But what's interesting there is that you see kind of age-long mates or whatever, and they're kind of all looking at each other, being like, "You're over there, like, what's this?" And it you kind of see from that kind of really, really simple kind of silly exercise, you kind of see how little they sometimes know about each other's views almost. Like they just don't have the space quite often to have these conversations. Because like Lee said, you know, all schools should be doing citizenship, but they often don't. And sometimes if they do, there isn't that trained teacher to be able to do that. So there is that kind of real lack of space, which again, I don't want this to sound like we're putting the onus of the blame on schools and teachers. It isn't. There is just a fundamental lack of time, space, and funding within the sector in general, which I think needs to be addressed at the government level, if I'm honest. But there is that lack of space. But when schools make that space, you can tell and see the difference. Like the schools that we go into, and you see the kids that are able to just have those basic conversations, maybe not even necessarily being able to build up the skills because they may not have the teaching stuff, but just having that space to have those concrete debates. Because like you say, you know, language for different young people, you know, it is very different depending on the kind of background they are, the race, religion, ethnicity, gender, whatever it may be. Every idea or issue and the language they use to broach that issue is going to be slightly different. And to properly, in my view, properly give people the tools necessary to then go out in the world, there's also that the tool and the ability to understand different points of view about the same topic. And yes, build empathy, but I would also say on the other side, building that emotional resilience to understand that just because you disagree with someone does not mean you need to A, be offended by that thing, and 2, doesn't mean you need to be attacking the individual. And that's something that we see on social media a lot, where you know, you disagree with someone, you attack the person, not the issue. And if I'm honest, the media don't help in this case, where they often have 2 commentators that tend to be quite combative against each other, which, you know, makes good clickbaity content. But again, in terms of oracy and creating good positive debate, that is not a good example. But if the only example young people have is what they see online or on TV or on radio, we as a society are going to start emulating that. And we can see that in the way we broach debates. So schools, I think, are really that kind of pressure point of being like, well, we need to show something better. We need to show something different. And that's really where oracy comes in the context of political and media literacy. And just one last thing I wanted to mention as well, which I think is relevant in terms of the research that we partnered up with actually speaking citizens at the University of Sussex. My bad on the slight verbal typo earlier. Was that aside from the teachers that we engaged with, we also did a survey of parental attitudes, which I think sometimes we tend to forget, because obviously parents do have a lot of sway in regards to schools, and obviously parents tend to be voters as well. And what we found is that parents are overwhelmingly supportive of political and media literacy, which again, for us and I'm sure speaking citizens and so on, you know, that includes oracy very much so. Like it's all part of that same, I'd say, skill set. And it's interesting because often there was this idea of, oh, parents don't want their kids to learn this stuff because they don't see it as career progressive, or they see it as potentially partisan or whatever else. That's just all misinformation. It's clearly not true. From the research that we found, parents want this kind of stuff. So there is this change in attitude in general as a whole in society of people wanting this work and schools wanting to deliver this. Essentially what we need is that push from government to give schools the environment that they essentially need to make this functional, because at the moment schools are struggling. It's
Stuart, can I come in there? Because what I had
please, yeah,
so say kind of comes off that a little bit. I mean, one thing that I played with a few years back with the English Speaking Union, we came up with a little trial. It hasn't come to much yet, but I hope it might do. Is around the work I've done on productive educational dialogue, I tried to come up with an alternative for formal debate where you could still have teams and scores and stuff, but making it less antagonistic and actually make the judging and the scoring about the quality of the debate as a whole and how much movement in understanding had taken place during it. But because in many ways, formal debate is the antithesis of dialogue, because if people are committed to certain positions at the start, then they invest their ego in maintaining those positions, and their only alternative is to try and attack the opposition, and they're not allowed to demonstrate respect for or to be swayed by the arguments of the opposite. So, and of course we have a House of Commons and the like based on such arrangements. So it's we're badly in need of alternative models for political discourse that are less antagonistic. But with respect to the question, I mean, I have to, in a sense, it's not phrased in a way that I would come at it. It doesn't quite accord with my view of speech and identity, because for me, students, it's not so much about the students reflecting their identities, it's about them enacting their identities and building their identities through speech. Because we all have heritages and backgrounds and histories, but unless they are spoken about, they diminish and they fade. And so you bring them to life through talking about them and through them being valued through speech and then in other means as well. It's more that, I think, than revealing an identity that's already there. So, and critically, that sort of enacting of identity happens in relationship with others through processes of identifying, disidentifying with other things or positions, reformulating one's identity. So students are, I think, if given the opportunity, their identities are constantly emergent from thoughtful engagements across difference with others, where the difference between their position and others prompts them to situate themselves in discussions, in history, in culture. And, and I think that view of identity as emergent and dynamic can serve us more powerfully than a kind of a representative view that sees them as fixed and needing to be, placed around the table, that they have to, breathe and sort of come out of that instead.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Rupert. No, and the emergent view of identity is something which develops through intercourse, through dialogue, through discussion. Is something which really concords with my own sort of research and background. Maeve, if I could bring you in on the discussion of language, culture, and identity, and this emergent view of identity that's something that's performative and positional, as well as it's not as static. It's something which develops through the discussions we have and the dialogues that children enter into.
Yes, sure. Just a couple of things I would like to mention in relation to Gaelic medium, education. One is planning. I mentioned that earlier, which is crucial. It's so important. And the other is removing barriers. And in thinking about planning, and in considering that the majority of students coming into Gaelic medium education are coming in where it is not the language of the home. So everything needs to be planned. Their language acquisition, their development of fluency, it has to be planned for, and it has to be planned for in a thoughtful and a meaningful way. And it has to cover a range of contexts, and it has to involve a range of partners and other individuals to support the confidence building, to enable that the dialogue and the discussions and the speech that comes from their language development, and they'll use it, they'll learn at different rates. So some children will use Gaelic with English words peppered through sentences, whereas other children will use it quite fluently and quite confidently, or they will put a Gaelic spin on an English word to make it seem more Gaelic, and it's and that's actually to be celebrated and applauded, because it's that kind of moving picture. That's their journey to their fluency development, and also in terms of removing barriers, so that we're enabling children to speak freely and naturally, and again with confidence, and engaging with as many role models, fluent speakers as they can, and also taking real account of their voice, their pupil voice. What is it they want to talk about? What is it they want to learn more about? And giving them that language. And back to what something that Rupert talked about earlier about the first question was, if they don't have those role models, if they don't see those interactions happening with adults, then it's going to be difficult for them to then take that on board. So yeah, I think those were the two things that I just wanted to add to the discussion and to the question.
Thanks very much, Maeve. That's wonderful. Right, we're starting to run slightly short on time, so I'll move on to my final question for us to consider. And then we've got one question in the Q&A already, which I want to draw attention to. But my last question is, how can citizenship education and engagement with Oracy contribute to students' exploration of senses of self? And this is sort of, again, so conceiving of identity, culture as something that's not preconceived or static, but something which emerges through exploration in various settings, not just in schools, but school being an important part of that. Lee, I wonder if I can come to you firstly on that question.
Yeah. Well, I think partly it's picking up on the ideas that people have already suggested, and it's certainly moving beyond some of the more traditional polarizing forms of conversation where kids feel they need to join the for or against tribe, or are allocated for and against tribe, and then kind of dig in for the rest of the discussion. I think it's just about building a culture where you give children more space to explore all the wider variety of nuanced positions, but also then thinking about how we frame those conversations so that the big political issues that we're all that are tearing society apart are brought home, so that we can think about how they connect to us locally. So one example, I was in a school using some of our resources. Whilst we've had the Oracy framework taken away from us by government, we have been given the responsibility to promote the fundamental British values. So to try and find a silver lining in that particular strange grey cloud, we took the notion of tolerance and turned it into a topic for discussion. But rather than get the kids to talk about it in any abstract sense or some kind of general political sense, to look at the limits to religious freedom. And we went to a religious school and we pulled together a group of kids who were interested in having the discussion. And they were reflecting on the broad principles about the limits on religious freedom and freedom of expression, the nature of toleration, but in relation to what they thought their school policy should be around collective worship. And because there were kids from different religious traditions in the group, then the conversation flows brilliantly from kind of basically re-articulating the classic, conundrum at the heart of liberalism about the degree of toleration and the limits on toleration, to whether the Muslim kids felt comfortable being frog marched off to church once a week to participate in services. And if they do go, do they sing? And if they do sing, do they pray? And if they do pray, do they mean it? And what's a reasonable way for the school to manage itself? And what struck me about those conversations is that it's of no surprise to anyone that has worked in schools with young people, is when they're given the space to have the conversation and then they're given a kind of reasonably structured opportunity to talk for an extended period of time, they are really thoughtful and engaged and interesting. And we've talked about empathy and sympathy, but a colleague of mine in Northern Ireland, where all of this often takes a slightly kind of sharper focus, has reframed this as political generosity. And I find that a really important distinction, that it's being open with the kids, that yes, you might really find other people aggravating, and you might really be at odds with their fundamental worldview, but you can learn to exercise political generosity to others, which is essential to learning to live with them. That's quite abstract if you launch into a kind of general political discussion, but the kids are living it in the classroom every day because they know what it is to rub up against people who are annoying, or to rub up against people who live lives that their parents think are sinful or dodgy or wrong or whatever else it might be. So I think it's really going with the grain of people's lived experiences, not thinking we can teach this from textbooks, but thinking we must connect these discussions and debates with kids' real lived experience of diverse lives, and then working hand in hand with teachers so that they don't run a mile for fear of what's going to happen, but make sure there's a supportive structure in the school so that they can engage in these conversations. And I think when you talk to teachers that use these pedagogic approaches routinely, they are a great source of professional pleasure, and they are the thing that helps them connect to their children. I mean, the question we probably should be asking is how could it possibly be that some schools don't do this? How do they relate to their kids? How do they build relationships? Anyway, that's probably enough from me on that.
Exactly. No, it's a good rhetorical question. Any responses or answers to the rhetorical question there?
Well, it brought me in mind of Zygmunt Bauman's phrase when he talks about moving from tolerance to solidarity. Tolerance is a very low bar for what we're after, really, in our society. It means, you won't kill me, I won't kill you. We'll dislike or even despise each other, but we won't physically get in each other's way. Solidarity is recognizing that we have genuine differences, but we also have genuine connections as human beings, and we see each other's value, and we feel our differences as curiosities, sometimes as irritants, sometimes as burning questions or dilemmas that keep us awake at night. And yet solidarity demands that we live with those and respect those, not to try and overcome them or make them disappear, but to learn from them and to learn to live among each other in that. And the only way to resolve it is through ongoing dialogue, not the attempt to close or just to batten down our hatches and create borders and then agree to leave each other alone.
Absolutely, yeah. Moving beyond tolerance to solidarity and empathy, as Sonia was saying before as well. Okay, I want to. Teresa's put up a question in the Q&A. Teresa, I wonder if I can bring you into the discussion. Would you be willing to put the question yourself to the panelists?
Yes, I could.
Thank you, Teresa.
I'm interested that no, there hasn't been any mention of educational drama through all these 2 days, really 3 days, and to me, it's a very important space if handled rather less towards theatre and towards social drama, than for people to learn the skills, and there's very little emphasis nowadays. Learn skills needed for citizenship and for oracy, all of those things which I have had some experience of, and I'm just wondering why we don't hear very much about educational drama these days on the curriculum.
It's a good question. I don't know who'd like to respond to that firstly.
Maybe, Stuart, if I would just come in, certainly in Scotland, under Curriculum for Excellence, drama does have a prominent place within our curriculum, and it is a space that is certainly used in the development of Gaelic language, and supports some of those barriers that children may come up against. So certainly in Scotland, it is given a place and a space, and is part of the curriculum.
I think that certainly in primary and nursery schools, role play and drama are part of the learning process, and I do think the opportunities to create role play spaces, particularly in early years classrooms, that enable children to move their knowledge forward through the talk, is really through their talk and their interactions with others within that space, I think is a really important part of the curriculum. I do think primary schools kind of plan in opportunities for role play, but again, it's not a formalized thing in primary. It's not a curriculum thing necessarily. So it can be a little bit hit and miss across schools, but I'd like to think that most schools, certainly most primary schools, are doing some sort of role play and drama on a regular basis to enable children to have opportunities to really put talk and oracy at the heart of what they're trying to move forward, particularly in subjects like PHSE. It's kind of an RE and things like that. It's kind of something that is done on a regular basis.
Teresa, there's a new book which I just took receipt of last week, edited by Ian Davis and Edda Sant and some others in the world of citizenship education, which is exactly on this theme. It's looking at the connections between citizenship and drama education from a global perspective. So there are chapters in there from all around the world, but it picks up that point. I suppose maybe one of the reasons why we didn't mention it pragmatically is it's because it feels like another area of the curriculum that's been clobbered. So taking one weakened, marginalised area of the curriculum and expecting it to be the answer to another weakened area that's been marginalised probably doesn't sound like it's very helpful. But there is definitely crossover, and I suspect that shared kind of connectedness is probably a part of the explanation as to why they're feeling a bit marginalised at the moment.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks, Sonia and Maeve, and thanks, Teresa, for the question. I think it's a really valid question and an interesting point. Our hour is very nearly up, which brings us to the end of the session, the end of the conference. Now, I didn't know if anyone had any final comments or reactions they wanted to contribute. If not, we can bring things to a close. So I don't see any hands raised or anything particularly pressing. But if I could thank you all once again for contributing to today's roundtable. I think this has been a really wonderful discussion, and some really fruitful ideas have been sort of discussed, and the dialogue's been really valuable. So thanks very much to all of you. And as I say, this brings us to the end of our Uses of Oracy conference, and I'd just like to thank all the attendees, all the participants, and the 9 sessions we've hosted over the last 3 days. I think it's been, certainly for me and for I think the rest of our research team, it's been a really productive conference, and we've just really appreciated the engagement from everyone. This isn't the end of the conversation or the end of the dialogue by any stretch, so we'll continue talking, we'll continue to discuss these issues over different channels, and as I say, just thanks very much to you all, and I'm sure the rest of my colleagues, the rest of the team would like to express their thanks as well.